Hello and welcome to Titanic Legacy, a podcast that explores Titanic's lasting impact through conversations with creators, artists, authors, historians, filmmakers, musicians, entrepreneurs, heck, video game developers we've had recently on, and so much more. People who continue to keep the Ship of Dreams legacy not only alive, but thriving, seemingly growing into the future through their creative work. I am your host, Paul Carganilla, and today I am thrilled and honored to bring you a conversation with a man who is a legend in the Titanic community and needs no introduction within the community, at least. And if you're new, relatively new, a Titanic enthusiast or a casual Titanic connoisseur, I'll just let you know briefly that our guest today, Don Lynch, is a pinnacle Titanic author and historian. He's already forgotten more about the Titanic's passengers than I will ever learn, I am sure. And he's authored the books Titanic: An Illustrated History, Ghosts of the Abyss, among others. His book, Illustrated History, helped pitch and greenlight James Cameron's '97 film. He has served as an on-set historian on that movie and even got to play Frederick Spedden in the top spinning scene. He's been down to the wreck to see Titanic with his own eyes twice, once sitting next to Mr. James Cameron himself on 9/11, actually. And he has been the official historian for the Titanic Historical Society for several decades, and over the years, he met and formed personal relationships with 20 survivors of the Titanic disaster, and also numerous family members of those survivors. Let's waste no more time welcoming him aboard. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to Titanic Legacy historian and author, Don Lynch. I accidentally call you a podcaster, but you've been on so many of these, and
I have, yeah. But thank you for the great introduction. I appreciate it.
you're basically a Titanic podcaster these days because you're so gracious to give us your time and talk to us about her. And I've had you as a guest on my other podcast, covepod, before. We've talked about your history with Titanic and your story and your experiences on the dive and going working on the film, going on set. But today I wanted to focus and kind of zoom in on your role with the Titanic Historical Society, of which I think I told you I joined last year as a card-carrying member of the Historical Society that used to be called Titanic Enthusiasts of America.
Yes.
And let me tell you how this whole conversation was inspired. I was on Facebook recently, and anybody in the Titanic enthusiast community is a member of many groups, and somebody had asked a question in one of the groups and said, hey, my 8-year-old, it seems like everybody gets into Titanic at 8 years old for some reason, but my 8-year-old is interested in Titanic. They're writing a paper. Where can I go for good facts? None of this nonfiction that's been created over the years, but good hard facts. And somebody said, you should go to the Titanic Historical Society website. And they asked, what's that? What's the Titanic Historical Society? And so I thought it'd be great to just have an episode that focuses squarely on this organization, and who better to talk to about it than yourself. You're still the official historian?
I'm still the historian, and I'm still on the board. Yeah, so still affiliated with it. Yeah.
How did you come to be affiliated with it? Was it before or after you wrote your book in '92?
Oh no, way before that. It was over 50 years ago. I wrote to Harland and Wolff when I first started doing research, and they recommended I join it. And that's right about the time they changed their name from TEA to, just, I guess the initials look good or something. Even though I think they probably had more foreign members than they had American ones. And they decided to go with Titanic Historical Society, which is generally more of what it was. It wasn't just a group of enthusiasts. They really were a historical society at that point. And so they changed the name and, haven't looked back as far as that goes. That's, held up very well for them.
So if you joined 50 years ago and they were formed in '63,
Yeah, I joined in '74, I think it was. Yes.
So they bring you on as an official historian because of your wealth of
Well,
knowledge.
Well, that came later. I mean, they made me
Okay.
their official historian later. At that time, it was Jack Eaton, who was one of the original founding members. It was formed in 1963, and it was kind of an interesting story because, the 50th anniversary had just happened, and there had been a lot of, press about some survivors and things, and several in New York had been interviewed, including a man named Walter Belford, who, was a baker or something, he claimed. And so, a few people were writing to him, whatever. I know Joe Carvalho, who was also one of the original members, wrote to him, and I think Ed Commuta did. Well, then he died soon after the 50th anniversary. And so someone reached out to his landlady because he had no family and said, what happened to his things, his Titanic memorabilia that he might have had? And she said, well, I just cleaned out the apartment and threw everything away, because he had no family. And so they were horrified that, obviously or apparently some things were lost. And so they decided they needed to form an organization that would help to preserve these sorts of things and get the survivors involved and people so this wouldn't happen again. And the irony was he was a hoax. He was never on the Titanic. He just was an imposter, but he got to go to, events and things and be interviewed and was enjoying the notoriety in his old age. He was over 90 when he died. And so there probably wasn't any memorabilia in his apartment, but him being an imposter was the reason, or not, I mean, the fact that he was claiming to be a survivor, it produced the Titanic Historical Society in a way. So it worked out. There was purpose to it in the end anyway.
It's so interesting how immediately after the event or the disaster, people didn't want to talk about it. The people of Belfast, put it out of their memory and just said, for many, many years, tried to dissociate with it.
Yes.
And many survivors wouldn't talk about it.
Mhm.
And there's so many missed opportunities, I think, throughout in the years immediately following the disaster to preserve things and to make sure that stories are told and recorded and that items are kept. And it's only in hindsight, many years later, that we think, 50 years it took to form this organization. What did the beginning of this organization look like?
Well, it was basically several of these people, Ed Commuta, Jack Eaton, Frank Casilio, and Bob Gibbons and Joe Carvalho, I think, were the ones who got together initially at Ed Commuta's home. And just they'd been in touch with each other, and it's like, okay, we need to form this. And so they decided to form this organization. And it was interesting because I think there was sort of an emphasis on model building at that time. That seemed to be what people wanted to do, to remember the Titanic was to build models. There wasn't any kit you could buy, and so people were more creative. And so I think the original applications for membership even asked if you had built a model. But they got together at Ed's home and decided to put this together. And they came up with the idea that survivors should be honor members and be a member for free. And in the beginning, they had more honor members than they had regular members because they got the list of people that I think the rank organization had found a list of survivors when the film A Night to Remember came out in the 50s, and then just, through research or whatever, found others. And some survivors then said, oh, I also know of so and so, like some of the people in Southampton said, well, I see so and so all the time. He still suffers with his feet from being frozen in the water or whatever. And so, there were a lot of those, and they did share their memories, and some of those memories we might not have had otherwise, because they would write back and tell what happened to themselves. And some of them shared their belongings. And of course, some of the important ones are from Frederick Fleet, who in 1965, he was the lookout who sighted the iceberg. But when his wife died, and his brother-in-law was sort of, turning him out of the house and saying, well, I'll only let you live here because you're married to my sister. And he committed suicide. But before he did that, he sent his things to Ed Commuta and gave them to him because Ed had been corresponding quite regularly with him. And Ed even shared the letters with the Southampton police when they were investigating a suicide, because he sent him these letters saying he didn't know where he was going to go or what he was going to do, that sort of thing, which the society still has those letters in their archive. And they built up a fairly good archive over the years of things that came off the Titanic. And in recent years, they partnered with they call themselves museums, but they're really attractions. But the Branson, Missouri, and Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, where they display some of these things, like a member of the crew, I think one of the doctors on the Carpathia, kept Mrs. Astor's life jacket because it was off of Mrs. Astor, and the family had it for decades and decades and decades, and then they donated it to the Titanic Historical Society. And now a lot of these things, the society has its own small museum in Springfield, Massachusetts, but the better items are now being lent out or, I guess, rented out, you might say, to these different places for display, such as the life jacket and the discharge book of Frederick Fleets and things like that.
So how did it start? Was it meetings? And
Yeah, these I think there were five guys had a meeting, and then they would just you meet occasionally, on periodically, and it in a way it was kind of sad because they always would meet at Ed Comuta's home, and his father didn't approve. He thought this was nonsense, and so. Whenever his father would go, his father and mother would go to the, baseball games at Fenwick Park in Boston or something like that. And, then Ed could have a meeting and have his buddies over. But it was funny because then on the way back from Boston, or Fenway, I'm sorry, I call it Fenwick, but Fenway, on the way back from Boston, his mother would say, well, we need to stop and use the restroom. And then she'd get to a payphone and give him a heads up that they were on their way home, and that would end the meeting. And so it was really kind of sad that his father didn't approve of this. And so, but Ed persevered, and so it was always in what was then Indian Orchard, which is now a suburb of Springfield, where they lived. And so, maintained. But they started. They had a meeting in 1965, and one of the survivors came to it, Frank Goldsmith from Ohio. And then in 1973, they had another one, and it was, of course, the following year I joined, but I think they had six survivors come to that one, and that was in Greenwich, Connecticut. And so then in 1977, there was a meeting for all the members again in Greenwich, and that was the first one I went to. And, got to meet Ed and a few other people, and including George Behe, who's an incredible historian, and we've been best friends ever since. And but Mrs. John Pillsbury Snyder was there, one of the first class passengers, and Frank Goldsmith again came back. So, and then after that, again focusing on the meetings, but they were sort of looked like they had them every 5 years. So they had one in 1982 in Philadelphia, and at that time their archive was on loan to the Philadelphia Maritime Museum. So they had one in Philadelphia, and there were five survivors at that one. And then in 1987 they were planning one, and then sadly, Ed inherited a jewelry business from his folks, and literally the roof fell in, I guess, having a bad winter. And he was like, I can't plan this. And I said, well, we have to have one for the 75th. And, they just found the ship, and we have to have one to get our members together so we can all talk about the ship being found, the wreck. And so I took on the one from 1987. And my gosh, we had over 1,000 people at that because Dr. Ballard came and spoke, and we had, I think, 10 survivors. And it was in Wilmington, Delaware. We tried to have it in Philadelphia, and we couldn't find a hotel or something. We ended up in Wilmington, Delaware. And it was a massive event. I kind of knew at the time history was being made. But as a result, it sort of fell on my shoulders to organize the conventions after that. And so it was so popular, we did one the next year. And we actually had, I think, 11 passengers from the Titanic, which was the largest gathering of survivors in 30 years since the premiere of A Night to Remember in 58. And in 88, we had as many then, the largest gathering. And then after that, of course, the numbers started to dwindle for the survivors and things. And we haven't had them since COVID. We were trying to have one when COVID started and didn't work out very well. And so, and the gatherings when the survivors passed away, and we used to show movies, and now of course everybody can stream those movies, the historical things. And so the conventions weren't as large after that. They kind of, I think after that we had one in 92 that was like 550 people. And, it just sort of got smaller, but they were great ways for us to get together. It really was, you bond so well with these people when you get together and meet them in person. We meet a lot of people through these groups online, but until you sit down with them and actually chat with them and talk, and they really become your friends, then that's when it really becomes something. And so there's a lot of, importance to these, actual groups getting together.
I'm glad to see that a lot of that is still happening here and there. I got to first time I met you in person was at the Titanic conference in Las Vegas
Yeah,
in
that wasn't a society meeting. That was a
right.
separate meeting. And we also used to do, I can't say that because that means something awful in Texas, but wonderful person, Mike Rudd, and whose son is Paul Rudd, the actor. He was a member. He was a Titanic guy, really into it. And he had a company out of Kansas City where he put together group tours. And he came to our 1992 convention and he approached me and said, you need a group tour of Titanic sites. It's just Southampton, Belfast, Cove, places like that. And it's like, hey, when the convention's over and I've got time, reach out to me, call me. And he did, and so he put together a number of tours. And so he'd take, a busload of people all over England and Ireland and even France and places like that. And, we got to see Harlan and Wolff when the buildings were still there. And Mike was a great guy. I mean, just so personable and, fantastic guy. And he could open doors. And, there was this enormous memorial service in April of 1912 at St. Paul's Cathedral. Well, he got us up in the bell tower, which isn't open to the public, and got them to show in the entry book where they had the service, for the Titanic Memorial, and what had been played and what the bell ringers had rung on their bells and that sort of thing. And so then we got to walk around the outside of the tower, which is a little scary. But he could do that. I mean, you get down into the bottom of the dry dock at Harlan and Wolff, where the ship actually had been. And rather than just stand at the edge and look down, it'd take us down into the very bottom. And he could talk people into opening up their doors and doing everything. And sadly, Mike's gone. But, the society had these wonderful tours for a while there that were just fantastic and had the best time with those.
I did see photos of those tours. I told you personally offline that I've been collecting commutators that I find on eBay, which are the official journal of the Titanic Historical Society.
Yes.
And can you tell, you've done a lot of writing for these. Can you tell us about the commutator?
Well, yeah, it's the first one I think was called the Marconi graph or Marconigram or something, and the Marconi company heard about it immediately when there were hardly any copies of it. The very first issue was just I think two sides of a sheet, maybe one side, and they immediately contacted the society and said, "You can't use our name." And like, "Oh, right, that makes sense." So commutator, which I understood was because people don't know what that is, and apparently I don't either. I remember it meaning that it was sort of an inclinometer on ships, a thing that would tell the amount you were like, maybe the list or if you were tilting forward by how much or something.
That's what I
But
thought it was.
yeah, I thought so too. And of course, I just looked it up online just to verify that. And apparently it's an electrical device of some kind that, is able to switch power from one polarity to another or something. And that's all and I even tried commutator maritime equipment or something, and that didn't come up. So, maybe they don't make commutators anymore, but that's the name of the magazine. And it's been going on since, 1963, every quarter. It's digital now, it's online, but and you can also get back issues of when they're printing it from the society's website,
Mhm.
titanic.historicalsociety.org, because they sell books and items like that. And some of the things are things that people, just like want like pins or whatever, and maybe tie clips I think they might have. I don't haven't been on the website lately to remember what they have, but they do have, books for sale. And the society's actually published a few books. They've put out their own publications. There's one about the Navratil children, the two little boys who were being kidnapped and taken on the Titanic. And I know I think Frank Goldsmith's memoirs of his as a survivor, they've been published. And so they have, a lot of publications and things as well that's available on the website.
That website again is titanic historical society.org. And I love going through these issues because, it's the new information that they're gathering and publishing at the time of. I've
Yes.
some issues from the 60s. I got some from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And it's so interesting to see, these different writers are contributing new articles and sharing new things that have been found and photos from events, flyers for upcoming events. It's all so fascinating to flip through. Were the events that they had always in April, or were they different times of the year?
No, they were either in April or in the fall because the society was formed in September.
Hmm,
And so occasionally they would have one to coincide with an anniversary of the society versus an anniversary of the sinking.
gotcha.
And so, and some, like one time, I think we just had, well, a couple of times we had just a dinner, just a very small event, just, for people to get together without going to a lot of production as far as, speakers and events and things like that. Often when we do in a city, we'll try to get a bus tour of some kind to local sites. Almost any place you go. We did one in Denver one year, and we had a bus tour that went up to Leadville, where Margaret Brown, the unsinkable Molly Brown, lived, as did Benjamin Guggenheim, back who's, from a mining family. And so they were both from there. So we sent a bus up there with people, and a lot of people signed up for that. But of course, there are many sites, in Denver itself. There were several passengers as well as Margaret who lived there at some time or another. I think one, Hugh Rood was there. He died, but his house is still there.
Hmm.
And so, almost every city, like if well, we have them in Los Angeles, we can take people to the cemeteries and show them graves of Titanic survivors as well as celebrities. And of course, we've been on the Queen Mary a few times because it's always fun to actually do something on a ship, even if it is not quite as old as the Titanic. And we had one event on the Queen Mary, and people still talk about, because we weren't the only group on board. There was the International Foundation for Gender Education, and so there were a lot of cross-dressers, and as we say, the Mary wasn't the only queen in Long Beach that weekend. And so and people transitioning, it was a whole convention for about gender education.
Wow.
And so, that was sort of funny, but and then apparently there was a boat in the harbor they were filming a porno film on, and it sank, and they were fishing naked people out of the water. And we had one guy who had never left Alabama before, one member, and he was so excited to be there and be around other Titanic enthusiasts. And he called home to tell his boss all these things that were going on. And his boss was like, "You get on a plane and you get home right now." That's that horrible place, California. And then a pipe burst right outside the main dining room. And so the room was flooding at dinner. And people actually, they thanked me for the realism, this sort of thing. But, we had to enter through a back entrance into the main dining room for our banquet. And then, of course, the banquet next to us was having a lesbian wedding. And so, it was just, fun. And so, the word went out about this one convention and just all the other things that were going on the ship at that time or near the ship. And it really, was comical. I mean, people just thought it was hysterical that all these things were happening, but it just, made it more interesting and fun. But, and some of these people would look at us like, you're here remembering the Titanic, why? And we're like, "You're here in a sundress and you have a beard. What do you?" It was like, well, don't call us odd. It's like, everybody's got their own thing.
Yeah.
So, but, and I'm not saying that to put them down in any way, because it's really, it actually, I just go off topic, but it was actually educational for me because I learned the difference between a transvestite and a drag queen. A drag queen wants to look like a woman and, makeup and everything, and a real transvestite just needs to wear women's clothing. So they still had beards and whatever, and it's just they just had to wear women's clothing. So I learned a little bit just peripherally myself. So, but we had just incredible events over time. I always remember I have fond memories of some of the conventions. I remember the one in Wilmington for the 75th anniversary. And the survivors who arrived first were the ones from England. There were two, Bertram Dean, who was only 2 years old at the time, not quite two, and Edith Haseman, who was 15 at the time. So here she's 90. And so she looked like she'd been on the Titanic. Bert didn't, So we had a little reception the first night before the thing actually started out by the pool. And, he's just standing at the bar chatting with all these people, and they don't even know they're talking to a survivor. He's just, another guy here at the convention. But the line for Edith to autograph things, went both directions away from the pool. And it just scared me to death that, we'd subjected her to this. And I just, went up and was like, "Edith, are you all right?" And she was just beaming. She loved the attention. There were survivors who just wanted no attention whatsoever. They didn't want it. They didn't need it. it didn't mean anything to them. They weren't really particularly care to remember the Titanic. And one survivor came to the 1973 convention, a lady from Canada, and she said afterwards she felt like a goldfish in a bowl and a monkey on display, and she would never go to one of those again. And I don't
Mm.
think they had 200 people at that convention. It was nothing. And so I think 120 or something. So, some of them didn't really enjoy it. Some of them, came. And, one lady in Michigan, she always sent her regards. We always invited her, of course. She didn't want to travel. But she'd always ask to be remembered to the other survivors, that sort of thing. But
I have to just drop a plug in as we're talking about conventions and meetings and the Queen Mary. We are having an event this April for anybody out there who's listening and wants to get together. It is a intimate. We're not having hundreds of people as previous events used to celebrate. But if you want to celebrate the anniversary of Titanic with us on the weekend of April 12th through 14 on the Queen Mary, head over to titanicweekend.com. I've got all the information there. We hope to see you there. It is important for us to keep her memory alive in whatever ways we can. I had the pleasure of seeing you on the Queen Mary last April as well.
yeah.
And we're getting together again this year. You mentioned the survivors and how they dwindled. When did you start visiting them and gathering their stories?
Well, when I was old enough and on my own to travel, I moved to California out of college after about a year, and there were several survivors here in the LA area. There were actually four, but I didn't know about the other two. They kind of kept low profiles, but two who were kind of two of the best. Edwina Trout McKenzie, who was 27 when she was on the ship, and she had a very good memory and was perfectly sharp and lived to be 100. And so, I learned a lot from her because to speak to somebody who actually had booked their own passage and didn't, wasn't just a little child holding on to their, mummy's arm and, had more control over her life. And she waited until the last lifeboat, till collapsible D to leave the ship. And, I asked her one time why, and she said, well, when a ship sank, you died, and so we forget, we have 2020 hindsight. We know that if you got into a lifeboat, you were rescued. She didn't know. And so she thought when a ship sank, you died because that was what she grew up with. She grew up before radio
Mm.
and any of that. So that was her perception. But someone walked up with a little baby and they couldn't get a man and he couldn't get into the boat. But so we needed someone to take this baby, and no one else seemed to want to take it. So she just said, I'll take the baby. And she got into the last boat and survived and lived 73 more years. And the other one was a lady up the coast in Santa Barbara, Ruth Becker Blanchard, who was 12 at the time. And on her own, because she got separated from her mother and her siblings, they got off on boat 11, and she was still standing on deck when the boat left. And she got alone into boat 13 and was rescued. But was the boat that number 15 almost came down on top of, and all that. And she was very mature, and just she was holding these blankets. Her mother sent her back to the cabin for her, and she forgot to give them to her, and she was passing them out. And there's a crewman with a damaged finger, and she found that she had her father's handkerchief in her coat pocket and lent that to be used as a bandage. And she was conversing with a woman who didn't speak English, but someone could translate, and we believe it was Thelma Tuma, who was on her way to Wilkes-Barre, because her baby had been put in boat 11 and then they'd left before was allowed in. And so now she was crying. And so, Ruth, through this translator, offered to help her find her baby. And when they got on the Carpathia, she did help her look. And the woman, she didn't find the baby, but the woman did. And so, she was very mature, but she remembered everything perfectly as well. And her voice, her memory never changed. It was spot on, and little tiny details that she could always remember. Like she remembered seeing 5 rockets go up from the time she got up on deck. I mean, who remembers exactly how many you see, that kind of thing. And so she was sort of the last good survivor because she wasn't the last survivor, but she lived to the age of 90 and she died in 1990. And at that point, the ones who were older than her, who were still living, their memories weren't as good by then. And yet, hers was flawless to the day she died. So she was wonderful and just, very gracious lady, kind of, suffered with strangers, always wanting to meet her. And that got a little, nervous as you get older and more frail, you're reluctant to have strangers in your home.
Mm.
But so, her daughter, Ken Marshall, or I would try to be there when these people would come to interview her. And as her daughter once said, it's a good thing my mother was on the Titanic and not me, because I wouldn't have these people in my home. Some of them were a little odd, but Ruth was very gracious about having them, and she, was happy to share her memories. And so, and she'd still get a little upset, and she'd still think about it from time to time. Like I pointed out to her, and she never knew this, but the most children in any one family saved were three. And there were two women, her mother and a third class woman, who each saved three children. And Ruth had no idea that that was the case. And she really, it really preyed on her mind after that. She had to, and she started thinking about these things more in her old age. And she said, looking back, it just seemed like everything went like clockwork, and she'd reflect on the Titanic more. She'd sort of put it behind her for 70 years. And now finally, enough time had passed, she could talk about it without getting too upset. And so, she really started to think about it more and more. And so, she'd share, that she was, what her thoughts were and things like that.
Amazing. All right. So the society you mentioned hasn't had a convention or a meeting since COVID, but the commutator is still published online. If you're a
Yes.
member, you have access to that. What else is it still doing, and what does the future look like?
Well, future, well, it's mostly run by Ed Comuta's widow, Karen Commuta, and his sister. And um, there is a future. It's not going to shut down if they die or anything like that. It's a very solvent organization, which is actually kind of unusual in the maritime world, because of these artifacts they possess that they're able to lease out. And so, and there is a board. And I know Karen has set up how it will continue when she's gone. But as board members, we kind of want to review that and make sure it's still current, because, as anybody knows, like if you write your will, you need to look at it every few years, because you look at it and go, what was I thinking? This kind of thing, or times change, things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think we're sort of, the board is sort of hoping that, I shouldn't say this, on the blog because Karen knows, but kind of hoping that, we should get together and really go over this with her and just make sure that everything, and she didn't do this on her own. She did, any planning she's done with the society, has an attorney and everything on retainer. And so, that's still there. But, we still have the museum. We still have the catalog sales. The things sell through through the website. But you're also sold at the little museum. But also, these things are still being leased out. And so that needs to continue, all these things. So it needs to still be a commutator published 4 times a year, in digital or otherwise. And there still need to be gatherings. The society has really had a strong function over the years, and they are a go-to organization. I mean, obviously, James Cameron approached the society, when he was working on the movie, and Ed and Karen were involved in that as well. And different members of the society helped quite a bit. But even documentaries, when people do documentaries, they often will approach the society. And I know nowadays a lot of people want to go off and do more sensational documentaries because it's all about ratings, as
Right.
opposed to my day, being an old man now, when, documentaries were for the benefit, of the public, this kind of thing. And, when you watch something on National Geographic, you could believe it. And so, or PBS, but, and then now, so there's still a function. Authors still approach the society and ask, for, to be able to, questions, whatever, what's the background on this? And very often at this point, almost everything's been published in the commutator, but they do have, letters and things still. They have their archive. And so it's always been a great resource for people. And, back in the day, it was a big deal when something would be on the television, back when we had 3 networks, and there'd be, some show would do something about the Titanic, and they'd come to this historical society and they were able to help them. And so, it still serves a function. And so, it will continue. Karen enjoys publishing the commutator. She really enjoys putting that out. So, as long as she's able to, that's great. That's fine. But, at some point, we have to think about, I want to be comfortable that it will proceed, as well as it has over the years, because it has been the foremost organization of all kinds, and gosh, at one point, I don't know what the membership is today, but when the movie came out, I think the membership hit 10,000 people. It was the largest maritime organization in the world,
Hmm.
and nonprofit, whatever. So, that's, has a strong history that needs to be retained. And so it will continue on.
And you mentioned the museum is still there, and
In Massachusetts, it's the suburb of Indian Orchard, and always best to call ahead. But there is, they have a small museum there, but the best of the artifacts are in Pigeon Forge or Branson, Missouri, at the Titanic museums there. They're the ones who lease them, and they have like the life jacket and things like that.
Again, if you want to join, become a card carrying member of the society and get one of these fancy certificates like I have here, head over to titanic historical society.org and check out everything they have to offer. I'm very happy and excited to hear that it's not going anywhere. That is very important for us moving into the future. And that is something I posit and something I wanted to examine when I started this podcast last year is what does the future look like with everyone doing their own work to preserve either what has been documented or create new nonfiction inspired by Titanic. Titanic still today is inspiring people. We're creating, I think, more content than ever based around the Titanic just because the fascination continues to grow. I know I asked for 30 minutes of your time and I've gone over, but
That's that's okay.
I have one more question for you. For you, Don Lynch, looking at how, looking at the past as the historian and seeing the landscape today, looking ahead to the future, what do you think? Are you happy with how the Titanic has grown in the world and in society, or are you discouraged by what you're seeing mostly out there, or
Um,
what are your feelings?
I'm happy it's grown in popularity. Of course, the movie had a lot to do with that, and it is fantastic. Um, what I'm discouraged by is people believe the movie was a documentary.
Mhm.
They absolutely believe everything they saw in the movie, not just that Jack and Rose are real, but that like Rose's mother when she says, "Oh, the lifeboats be loaded according to class." They think every first class passenger thought like that.
Right.
And what I'm seeing more and more on social media, and I only do Facebook, is there's a lot of misinformation and people today seem to want to believe misinformation.
Hmm.
People, my age group, that we're all aging out, the historians from back in the day who, you know, searched and searched for the true story. And there was a lot of misinformation when I started, which we took for granted as being true because we'd seen it in books, but we've all learned you go to an original source. If you can't find an original source for it, you can't say it's true. But people don't want original sources now. They want to believe what they want to believe. And, I know there's been a lot of stuff on Facebook about the car, the Renault that was in the movie and, was being shipped by, Mr. Carter. And there's all these descriptions of the car out there. Well, we don't have any descriptions of the car. And until I see one, I believe we don't. We just know it's a 35 horsepower Renault.
Hmm.
And people have all these, they can describe it right down to the color. And it's like, well, even the family didn't know what description of it was. How would they? And, other things and things, artifacts, that come up for auction that, people believe because it's got some great story behind it. And yet, the provenance isn't there, that kind of thing. And so, people today, maybe they're just more romantic than they used to be, but they really want to believe something, whether it's true or not. They just want it to be true. They don't want to know if it's true. They want it to be true. And that's depressing, but I can't do anything more than what I can do. I can, point it out to people and, they can shoot me down, but, one day I'll be gone. And then what do they do? You want more people who will carry the torch and go for accuracy.
You, of course. You and Ken Marshall produced probably the most iconic account in your book, an illustrated history of everything that was known of it at the time. And you've mentioned in previous conversations that we've had that there's so much to be corrected in the book as more information comes out, but you
Yes.
don't think you'll publish an updated version. What is there a book out there, if you can say, that you would recommend to anybody to look at today, today's version of Titanic and Illustrated History, as far as what the best comprehensive work that's out there right now is?
Well, the book On a Sea of Glass is very thorough. And I will say, I don't think there is any book that is without some, and I don't want to say error, but, maybe, a slight misinformation or something, because I can't say it's perfect because, Lord knows I thought illustrated history was once, so, so I can't say there's any perfect book out there, but that is really right now a very comprehensive telling of the Titanic story, and it's very thoroughly researched and very well, footnoted, which, we didn't do back in the day. That's more common now, but, the that wasn't as common when we did illustrated history, and that wasn't an opportunity that was available given the time constraints at the time and all that sort of stuff. So, I still have all my notes for everything that went into illustrated history, but, that's the one that I would say if someone wants something absolutely comprehensive to know as much as they can out of one book, that's the book I would refer to.
Did you hear that, everybody? Don
Yeah.
Lynch still has the notes from his book. Those are probably those are an absolute treasure for sure. Keep those, hold on to those, preserve those. But yeah, I think even the Sea of Glass team has come out and said, not everything in there is right anymore, or there's information we need to update and change.
Yeah, and
But
they have. That's the beauty of having digital books. Although, the sad thing is, like you can get a first edition, and then the next year there's an updated edition, and it's like no. But and because I wrote to the authors after it came out, and I gave them comments and things that I felt could have been said differently. We'll just say I don't want to say I was pointing out errors right and left. That wasn't true, but maybe they thought so, but I didn't feel that way. But I was just giving my comments and things, and I guess they did make changes, but they said the changes could make couldn't change the text on each page to spill onto another, because then they would have to go back and redo the entire index.
mm,
And so, that would have been a huge job. And so, but given how thorough it is and how well done it is, I can forgive them if that there was like a little change they couldn't make because they just didn't have that kind of time. That's fine, so. But no, I get it where, you can make changes now more easily than you could in my day when, it cost a lot to redo the plates for the book. It wasn't all digital back in the 90s.
well, for all the updates and the conservation of all important details and everything new that's coming out, get your quarterly subscription to the commutator from Titanic Historical Society. Become a member at titanichuhistoricalsociety.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe, rate, leave a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. This is grassroots effort. I do this out of passion and for fun because I love Titanic, and your listenership and your subscriptions and your ratings really fuel it and keep it going. If you love conversations with other inspirational creators, not necessarily Titanic related, head over to my podcast covepod for some more conversations with people doing inspirational stuff. I want to say thank you again for blessing us with your time, Don Lynch. You are simply the best. This has been a blast. I love talking to you anytime I have the opportunity. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in, listening in, however you're listening. Until next time, seize the day, follow your heart's fire, and make each day count. Thanks, everyone.